Okay, so. I need to get this off my chest. I've been carrying this around for months, and I can't keep it bottled up anymore. I'm not proud of what I did, but I also can't pretend it didn't happen. This is going to be long, messy, and probably make me look like the worst person alive, but here goes nothing. My name's Jessica, and I cheated on my husband. Not just with anyone, though. That would have been bad enough, but no, I cheated on him with his son. Yeah, you read that right. His son. My stepson. I know. It's messed up. It's so messed up that I can barely even process it myself. But I need to tell this story, so, here we go. Let me set the stage. I've been married to my husband, Mark, for about 5 years now. He's a good guy, stable, reliable, kind of boring, but solid. We met when I was in my late 20s, and he was in his early 40s. He already had a son, Ethan, from his first marriage. Ethan was 16 when Mark and I got together, and he was, well, he was your typical moody teenager. Quiet, brooding, kind of kept to himself. I never thought much of him at first. He was just Mark's kid, you know? Fast forward a few years, and Ethan's in college. He's 21 now, living on campus, but comes home on weekends sometimes. He's grown up a lot, tall, athletic, and, honestly, really good looking. I mean, I'm not blind. I noticed. But it wasn't like I was attracted to him or anything. He was my stepson, for God's sake. It was just an observation. But then things started to change. I don't even know how it happened, really. It was little things at first. Ethan would come home, and we'd end up talking more. He'd tell me about his classes, his friends, his life. He was actually really funny when he opened up, and I found myself looking forward to those conversations. Mark was always busy with work, so Ethan and I ended up spending a lot of time together. It felt innocent at first. Just two people bonding, right? But then there was this one weekend. Mark was out of town for a work conference, and Ethan came home to grab some stuff. We ended up having a few drinks, just casual, nothing crazy. But as the night went on, the conversation got deeper. He started talking about how he felt like he didn't really fit in with his friends, how he was struggling with figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. I tried to be supportive, you know? I told him he was young and had plenty of time to figure things out. And then? I don't even know how to explain it. There was this moment. We were sitting on the couch, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and something just shifted. It was like this electric charge in the air. I could feel it, and I know he could too. He leaned in, and I didn't stop him. And then, we kissed. I know. What the hell was I thinking? I wasn't. That's the thing. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Mark, or the fact that Ethan was my stepson, or any of the million reasons why this was a terrible idea. I just let it happen. And once it started, I couldn't stop. We didn't go all the way that night, but it was enough to cross a line that should have never been crossed. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because the truth is, I wanted it to happen again. And it did. After that first kiss, things got complicated. I wish I could say I came to my senses, that I put a stop to it right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself thinking about Ethan all the time. It was like this secret little thrill that I couldn't shake. I'd catch myself smiling when he texted me, or feeling this weird flutter in my chest when he walked into the room. I knew it was wrong, God, I knew, but I couldn't help myself. The next time Ethan came home, it happened again. Mark was at work, and Ethan and I were alone in the house. We didn't even talk about what had happened the last time. We didn't need to. It was like this unspoken thing between us, this tension that neither of us could ignore. He kissed me, and I kissed him back, and this time, we didn't stop. I'm not going to go into all the details, but let's just say it was intense. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I know that sounds cliché, but it's true. Ethan was young, passionate, and completely uninhibited. It was exciting in a way that my marriage to Mark had never been. And that's what made it so dangerous. After that, it became a pattern. Ethan would come home, we'd find a way to be alone, and, well, you can guess the rest. I told myself it was just a fling, that it would burn itself out eventually. But the more it happened, the more I realized how deep I was in. I was lying to Mark constantly, making up excuses for why I was acting so weird. I felt guilty, sure, but not guilty enough to stop. And that's what scared me the most. The worst part was, Ethan started to get attached. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way he'd text me all the time, even when he was at school. He started talking about how he wanted to be with me for real, how we could run away together and start a new life. And I didn't know what to do. Because as much as I cared about him, I knew it wasn't sustainable. I couldn't just leave Mark and run off with his son. That would have been insane. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Every time I tried to pull away, Ethan would look at me with those big, pleading eyes, and I'd cave. It was like I was addicted to him, to the way he made me feel. And the more it went on, the more I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, we could make it work. Things started to spiral after that. Ethan's visits home became more frequent, and each time, the stakes felt higher. It wasn't just about the physical stuff anymore, it was emotional. He'd tell me things like, "You're the only person who really gets me," or "I've never felt this way about anyone before." And I ate it up. I know how pathetic that sounds, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like I was the center of his world, that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But the guilt was eating me alive. Every time Mark hugged me or kissed me, I felt like the worst kind of fraud. I'd look at him and think, "You have no idea what I've done." And then, of course, there was the fear of getting caught. Ethan wasn't exactly subtle. He'd leave little hints, lingering touches when Mark wasn't looking, texts that were just a little too flirty. I kept telling him to be careful, but he didn't seem to care. If anything, I think he liked the risk. One night, things came to a head. Mark had gone to bed early, and Ethan and I were in the living room, pretending to watch a movie. We weren't even paying attention to the screen. He kept brushing his hand against mine, and I could feel the tension building. Finally, he leaned over and whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you." I should have shut it down. I knew I should have shut it down. But instead, I let him kiss me. And then, well, you can guess what happened next. What I didn't realize was that Mark had gotten up to get a glass of water. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked into the room. It was like the world stopped. For a split second, none of us moved. Then Mark said, "What the hell is going on?" Ethan and I jumped apart, but it was too late. The damage was done. Mark just stood there, staring at us, his face a mix of shock and disgust. I tried to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say to make this better? Ethan, of course, didn't help. He just sat there, looking like a deer in headlights. Finally, Mark turned to me and said, "Jessica, what the hell is this?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I was sorry? That it didn't mean anything? That would have been a lie. The truth was, it did mean something. And that's what made it so messed up. Mark didn't wait for an explanation. He just turned around and walked out of the room. I could hear him pacing in the kitchen, muttering to himself. Ethan looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. "What do we do?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. Mark didn't say a word to me for the rest of the night. He just locked himself in the guest room, and I could hear him pacing back and forth, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Ethan, on the other hand, was a wreck. He kept whispering things like, "This is bad, this is really bad, and what if he tells my mom?" I wanted to scream at him to shut up, but I couldn't. I was too busy trying to figure out how to fix this mess. The next morning, Mark was gone before I even woke up. He left a note on the kitchen counter that just said, "We need to talk. Tonight." No dear Jessica, no love, Mark. Just those 4 words, cold and final. I spent the entire day in a daze. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't do anything except replay the previous night in my head over and over again. What had I been thinking? How had I let things get this far? And more importantly, what was Mark going to do? Ethan texted me around noon. Have you talked to him yet? I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to blame him for all of this, for being so reckless, for not being more careful. But the truth was, I was just as much to blame. Maybe even more. When Mark finally came home that night, I was sitting on the couch, waiting for him. He walked in, took one look at me, and said, "Start talking." So I did. I told him everything, well, almost everything. I left out the more intimate details, but I admitted that Ethan and I had been involved. I tried to explain how it had started, how it had just kind of happened, but Mark wasn't having it. Just kind of happened, he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You kissed my son, Jessica. My son. How the hell does that just kind of happen? I didn't have an answer for that. Mark sat down across from me, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. Do you have any idea how messed up this is? He asked. You're my wife. He's my kid. What the hell were you thinking? I wanted to tell him I wasn't thinking, that I hadn't been thinking for months. But I knew that wouldn't make a difference. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Mark didn't say much after that. He just sat there, staring at me like he was trying to figure out who I was. And honestly, I didn't blame him. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. The days that followed were a blur. Mark moved out temporarily, saying he needed space to figure out what he wanted to do. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, he just left. And that silence was worse than anything. It was like I didn't even exist to him anymore. Ethan, on the other hand, was a mess. He kept calling and texting me, begging me to talk to him, to tell him what was going to happen. But I couldn't. I didn't have the answers he was looking for. All I knew was that I'd ruined everything, my marriage, my relationship with Mark, even my own sense of self. Mark and I eventually had the talk. It was awkward and painful, and neither of us really knew what to say. He told me he couldn't trust me anymore, that he didn't know if he ever could. And I didn't blame him. How could I? I'd betrayed him in the worst possible way. We decided to separate. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that made sense. Mark said he needed time to process everything, and I needed time to figure out who I was without him. As for Ethan, I cut off all contact. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. Whatever we had, whatever I thought we had, wasn't real. It was just a messed up fantasy that never should have happened. It's been a few months now, and I'm still trying to pick up the pieces. Mark and I are officially divorced, and Ethan, well, I don't know what happened to him. I heard he dropped out of college and moved to another state, but I don't know for sure. And honestly, I don't think I want to. Looking back, I don't even recognize the person I was during that time. I was selfish, reckless, and completely out of control. I hurt the people I cared about most, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. So, yeah. That's my story. I don't expect anyone to feel sorry for me, I don't deserve that. I just needed to get it out, to finally admit what I'd done. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive myself, but for now, all I can do is try to move forward. The end.